Hold on, this game came out August 11th in the States and even earlier in Japan. How is this a 25th anniversary video, you swindler? Look, I was working on a bunch of stuff first, and hey, we're still within the US launch month, yeah? I'd say this still counts well enough. Ahem. But yes, Chrono Trigger. So here's the deal. I have a short list of games that I believe are in reasonable contention for the coveted title of best game ever. And Chrono Trigger is near the top of that list. Games goated. I know that, you know that, everyone knows that. There are already plenty of videos dissecting it down to the bone marrow. So as much as I wanted to, I couldn't really write an hour-long video and pretend like I'd have that much more insight into a game that's been talked about for more than 2 decades. So as a fair warning, this video isn't gonna go that much in depth about the specifics of the story and gameplay and such, cause everyone and their cat has already done that. Instead, I figured I'd make a shorter video built around a single thesis. One coherent sentiment explaining what I personally think elevates this game to the absolute top tier of gaming. In the annals of history, why has Chrono Trigger managed to maintain its position as the exemplar of the JRPG genre, an exemplar of the Super Nintendo itself? Well, if you ask me, it comes down to one fundamental design philosophy that every aspect of the game revolves around. Chrono Trigger perfectly walks the tightrope between simplicity and complexity. It pushes its combat and plot as far as they can go before they fall into the same trap a lot of other JRPGs have been ensnared by, where increased complexity has been confused for increased quality. Of course, there's hardly any objective measurement for assessing whether something is too simple or too complex, so this is more me trying to work backwards to explain my gut feeling, rather than some uber granular analysis into how the game achieves this perfectly balanced state. Or to put it more casually, I'm basically just constructively bullshitting here. Still, I've played this game more than enough times to be able to roughly pinpoint what it's doing right. Let's look at the combat first, because I feel it's the easiest part of Chrono Trigger to look at through this sort of lens. It's your standard active time battle system, you know, wait for your bar to charge before you smack the enemies about. You have a pretty conventional set of elemental magic, you know, lightning, ice, fire, So that's your base vanilla ice cream, pretty average stuff. The cone this ice cream was scooped into was rather unique for the era. Think of those ones with the hardened fudge and sprinkles on them. Fuck, I'm hungry. As is well documented, there are no random battles and separate combat screen in the game. Rather, all the fights are in predetermined areas, mostly triggered by you brushing past the enemy's shoulders and them being so incensed by a lack of courtesy that a duel to the death is the only way to simmer them down. I can't tell you how much this does for the immersion. Because you can actually see enemies in front of you, it makes the world feel like a place that's actually inhabited by monsters and wildlife, not a cardboard cutout for you to run around in until the game gets bored and sicks a tarantula at you to check if you're still awake. That part of it is kinda tangential to the thesis though. The real element of combat that takes the vanilla base and elevates it is how you're able to take advantage of positioning. Rather than lining up to take turns kicking each other in the shins, both enemies and your characters splurge onto the battlefield, and enemies will sort of shuffle around as the fight progresses. This isn't just to add a hint of realism to proceedings, of course, as the game bestows upon you a bevy of different skills that have different areas of effect. For the most basic example, if they're all clumped up, you can use Whirlwind, which hits all of them within a certain radius. It adds just a bit of extra calculation to battles, as you have to stop and take stock of how your opponents are moving, and if it's worth taking the extra second to see if they line up for the perfect angle of attack. This is on top of the team attacks, where if you have 2 or more of the right characters with enough MP and filled ATB bars, you can do a super duper attack that fucks shit right up. None of this is too crazy, but but they make fights a bit more dynamic and add an element of resource management as you consider whether burning 2 ATB bars is worth the extra damage. And importantly, because battles aren't randomized, the devs could make sure to compose enemy teams in such a way to allow you to be able to use all your different abilities over the course of the game. See, my main issue with a lot of other JRPGs is that they see complaints about how rigid and simplistic turn-based battles were in the original Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy games, and severely overcompensated. I look at the endless pages of tutorials in games like Ni no Kuni, and I feel like developers are failing to recognize the inherent issue with overcomplicating battle systems in games where you're supposed to be engaging in battles rather frequently to earn experience. This is where the concept of balance comes into play. Yes, you want your system to be engaging and challenging enough where winning battles feels rewarding, but they can't be so overwrought that you're spending huge chunks of time in each battle, setting up dominoes for minutes before finally knocking them all down. I like games like Xenoblade and Octopath Traveler a lot, but I can't tell you how much time I was having to spend on even trash mobs, because setting up the right conditions to do real damage involved the layers of different offensive and defensive play, and then immediately after the fight is over I'd run into an almost identical mob. If you're like me, you'll inevitably start to get bored because of how out of whack the ratio of battle complexity to enemy numbers is. I don't mind this in games with a lighter story presence or a much shorter runtime like Devil May Cry, but in an RPG where you want to see what happens next, it can be a pace killer. Chrono Trigger understands this. It adds just enough on the tactical side of things to keep every battle interesting, but not so much that everything just drags out. It's not the only game to do so. I'd say the Shin Megami Tensei series and some Final Fantasy games have also done a good job of this. Still, maintaining a brisk gameplay pace is important in a genre saturated with games that are infamously overlong and padded. Speaking of pacing, dungeon design is another important aspect of Chrono Trigger's gameplay that hits the sweet spot of being just complex enough without being overbearing. To this day, most JRPGs are pretty damn lazy when it comes to dungeons. Maybe it's due to budget issues, but I swear that the most effort these games can summon is copy and pasting the same 3 hallways 50 times and randomly stapling them together. Throw in a token lever puzzle if the developers are feeling fancy. See, the main lesson people should have taken away from Final Fantasy XIII in particular wasn't that being linear is bad, it's that a complete lack of interactivity with the environment of the game makes it feel bland and lifeless. The cardboard cutout comparison crops up again, because despite the robust writing these games have, many of them don't feel like real worlds that allow for any interaction between anything other than player and enemy. Here's a vast world with a deep history in various cultures, and the only thing you're allowed to do is punch shit. Again, Chrono Trigger understands this. To give you a simple example, in an early dungeon, you're in a factory with a bunch of conveyor belts and claws and the like. Surely you should be able to manipulate these things, right? Well, yes, you are. And the game invites you to with a couple of short, simple puzzles that involve pulling the right levers in order. Nothing mind-boggling, but it fosters an important connection between the player and the world that they're playing in. Just a quick challenge that involves using the tools the environment provides, and it's on to the next thing. Quick is one of the operative words, as there are games that move too far in the other direction. I bought an RPG, gosh darn it, not Myst, so stop fucking with me. For instance, SMT Nocturne is right behind Chrono Trigger as my favorite RPG ever, but by god do some of the dungeons in that game drag like a motherfucker and ask a lot from you. I do like this to a certain extent, but there are cases where I had to admit to myself that I was getting frustrated and that the pace was getting too bogged down. As I said, pacing is important, and I don't like feeling like I'm adding even more time to a game that already takes like 90 hours to complete. That may just be a me thing, of course, and I'm sure there are many people who enjoy heavy puzzle presence in their RPGs, but I personally only really like them when used as a way to give the players a breather between combat heavy sections, and as a way to interface with the world. And that very world, along with the story and character characters of Chrono Trigger are just as much a part of this tightrope act as the gameplay. Like I said before, this video is less about touching on specifics and more examining the broad thesis, so I'm going to assume you're familiar with the game and don't need me to introduce these plot points. And if you haven't played it, then consider me mayor of Spoilerville, cause that's where you're headed past this point. Anyway, it's a world with rich history, which is just as well, considering you have to play through most of that history. You get a decent grasp for its core conflicts, such as the divide between human and monster in the present time, or the complete shambles the world is in the future. We understand the core ambitions of the villains and how they're shaped by the world they're in, and how their actions could have devastating consequences. In fact, better than most games, considering you have to travel to the future and see the exact results. It doesn't have the most head-spinning world building, and thanks to the inherent wonkiness of time travel, there are surely some nitpicks you could bring up if you're a pedantic misanthrope. But it's a very well-realized setting, and the game is very economical with its content, rarely introducing threads that go nowhere. I think it's the nature of the setting and the time travel. The writers weren't forced to come up with a world with too large a scope for them to fill with meaningful content. No, you just trace your steps through the same continent at different times, and everything just sort of logically snaps together. This is a very important part of the tightrope walk, because I've played too many RPGs where I get beaten over the head with terminology and location names and shit where I'm just like, Oh, it's all perfectly understandable so long as you're willing to climb up 6 dozen dialogue trees, or thumb through the in-game glossary for 5 hours. Again, I'm sure that's something a lot of people enjoy, but I feel there's an artistry in being able to build an interesting setting without having to write 9 novels worth of text. Yes, the dialogue in Chrono Trigger is relatively conservative for this sort of thing, which brings me to the characters. While I will concede they're not quite as multifaceted as some of their peers, and even the contemporaries such as the cast of Final Fantasy VI, they endear themselves to you quite quickly. Part of it is the fact that you're almost always introduced to them when they're actually doing shit. Actions speak louder than words, and Chrono Trigger's characters are defined by the things they do. How do you meet Marley? You bump into her at a fair she's not supposed to be at, and she teases you as you flit from activity to activity. You meet Luca as she's tinkering with some sci-fi shit. Isla bum rushes some dinosaurs, you get what I mean. I've played too many games where your future party members are just standing stock still, waiting for you to approach them so they can blurt out their backstory to you. Still, I would be the first to admit that one of Chrono Trigger's small flaws is that once you have most of your party, it has to pack most big character moments into the final side quests rather than weave them into the main plot. A byproduct of the fact that the game largely doesn't control who you have in the party. Most of the time, whoever's with you will be chipping in with their perspective on the going-ons of the plot, which is as good a way as any to keep the characterization rolling and add some replayability. I still prefer that to how a lot of other games go about characterization, where you, again, have to chase them up dialogue trees as they explain every dismal facet of their personality. Like I said, they may very well be more complex than Chrono Trigger's cast, but this is where the concept of pacing rears its head again. I can tell what these characters' deals are all about, their dreams, their aspirations, what they're interested in, all with some short exchanges and the actions they take. I don't have to stand stuck still as they jabber at me for half an hour. Even RPGs I really like, such as Disco Elysium, are so much more about telling rather than showing. What also helps is the character design. They brought Akira Toriyama onto this project so that he could draw his 5 faces, but look at these characters and tell me they aren't efficient at telling you what these people are all about. I'm hardly an expert in costume design, but from a layman's perspective, I'd argue that they have enough of a fantasy flair to make them distinct while not looking like the over-designed nightmares a lot of other JRPG characters have looked like over the years. No zippers and belts and random bits of trash glued onto their clothes that could only possibly be there to make cosplaying them a chore. The most you can say is that Chrono's hair is kinda dumb, but shit. Toriyama never did Gohan's hair red, so I guess it's alright, at least until he goes Super Saiyan God. Those are the main points I wanted to bring up in relation to the main thesis of the video. Everything is pushed just far enough to keep the game interesting and engaging before they become too much of a chore or too complex for their own good. There are some things I want to bring up that are kinda unrelated, but are still big parts of what make Chrono Trigger as legendary as it is. is. Being able to take on the final boss whenever you want is one of my favorite parts of the game. It makes a lot of sense. If you have the ability to travel through time, why wouldn't you be able to just waltz up to Lavos when he first shows up? The fact the game accommodates this with a dozen different endings based on when you decide to do this is the cherry on top. In a game like Breath of the Wild, you can take on Ganon at any point in the game, but A, you'll get obliterated, and B, there's no incentive to fight him until you've already done all the main plot missions unless you're bored and just want to see the ending. There's an actual reason to bother fighting Lavos early, at least if you're interested in seeing all the different endings. And the music. The music. If I had to pick any single game to bestow the best soundtrack ever title onto, it might very well be Chrono Trigger, which is pretty insane for a SNES game. I'm not much of a music head, so it's hard for me to put into words what makes the music so good, but it's just like, Okay, we went from constructive bullshitting to just regular old bullshitting. There's a lot of other things I could bring up that help elevate this game to GOAT status, but I don't want to repeat what a million other people have already said. Instead, I'll end the video by saying this. It's kind of absurd how little respect Square puts on this game's name. I might be wrong about this, and maybe there's a tweet out there somewhere, but I couldn't find any 25th anniversary celebration material or even any acknowledgement of the game. The only way to play on contemporary systems without emulation is through Steam, which is apparently still crashing on people to this day. Yes, they couldn't fully optimize a game that originally came out 25 fucking years ago. No PS4, Xbox, or Switch ports, not even on Nintendo Online. It wasn't in the SNES Classics lineup, which would be like not having Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation Classic. It's insane if you ask me. It's not like I need a port to these systems for myself, but I do worry that there might be an entire generation of gamers who will grow up never knowing that this game ever existed. Its legacy fading with every passing year. Ain't that a depressing thought? So yes, port please. That's all I'm asking. I don't need a full remake, mostly because I have zero faith in modern Square to handle that kind of project with any sort of tact. And I've never been one to push for a sequel to this game, because it's such a firmly wrapped, self-contained package that trying to squeeze another plot out of it would entail having to come up with a bunch of contrived bullshit to needlessly convolute a well-realized setting. Thank God they would never do such a thing. Hey, I said thank God they would never do such a thing. Yeah, sorry, but I'm good on that. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. You know the drill by now. Like, comment, subscribe, blah blah blah. Follow me on Twitter, share on your OnlyFans. And yeah, ma salama.